The Battle of Poltava on June 27, 1709 was the decisive victory of Peter I of Russia over the Swedish forces under Field Marshal Carl Gustav Rehnskiöld paragraph LD, in one of the battles of the Great Northern War. It is widely believed to have been the beginning of Sweden's decline as a great power, as the tsardom of Russia took its place as the leading nation of northeastern Europe. The battle also bears major importance in Ukrainian national history, as hetman Ivan Mazepa sided with the Swedes, seeking to create an uprising in Ukraine against the tsardom. Prelude: Charles XII led early Swedish victories in North Zealand and in the Battle of Narva in 1700. However, it would take 6 years before he defeated Augustus II of Saxony, Poland. Peter I withdrew from Poland in the spring of 1706, and offered to surrender all of his Baltic possessions to Sweden except St. Petersburg, but Charles refused. Peter subsequently adopted a scorched earth policy in order to deprive the Swedish forces of supplies. Charles ordered a final attack on the Russian heartland with a possible assault on Moscow from his campaign base in Poland. The Swedish army of almost 44,000 men left Saxony on August 22, 1707 and marched slowly eastwards. Charles took the field in November after waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Continuing east, Charles crossed the Vistula River on December 25, 1707, then continued through a hostile Mashuria and took Grodno on January 26, 1708 after the Russian troops had abandoned the city. At the time, the Russians had been occupied with a large rebellion of Don Cossacks, known as Bulovin Rebellion. This revolt was contained in part by the forces of the Cossack hetmanate led by hetman Ivan Mazepa. The Swedes continued to the area around Smorgon and Minsk, where the army went into winter quarters. Left in western Poland were 8,000 dragoons under Major General Ernst Detlev von Krasow. Poor weather and road conditions kept the Swedish troops in winter quarters until June. In July, the Swedes defeated Marshal Boris Sheremetyev's forces at the Battle of Holokan and advanced to the Dnieper River. During the spring, General Lewenhaupt in Courland had been ordered to gather supplies and march with his army of about 12,000 men to join Charles' forces. However, his departure from Ito was delayed until late June and consequently only joined Charles' forces on October 11. Rather than winter in Livonia or wait for Lewenhaupt, Charles decided to move southward into the Ukraine and join Mazepa, who had decided to rebel against Peter. Peter sent Sheremetyev to shadow the Swedish army. Lewenhaupt followed south and was attacked while crossing a river near a small village that gave name to the Battle of Lesnaya, losing the supply train and half of his force. In need of resupply, Charles moved towards Baturin, Mazepa's headquarters, but Russian troops under Alexander Menshikov reached the city first. Anticipating the Swedish arrival, Menshikov ordered the merciless massacre of the population, razing the city and destroying or looting arms, ammunition and food. By the spring, Charles' force was reduced to half of its original size. After the coldest winter in Europe in a century, Charles was left with 20,000 soldiers and 34 cannon. Short of supplies, Charles laid siege to the Russian fortress at Poltava on the Vskya River on May 2, 1709. Peter's force of 80,000 marched to relieve the siege. Upon his arrival, Peter built a fortified camp on the Vskya, 4 kilometers north of Poltava. While observing the Russian position on June 20, Charles was struck by a stray bullet, injuring his foot badly enough that he could not stand. In addition, Charles' last hope of reinforcement expired, as the Swedish forces under von Krasow had turned aside to deal with the anti-Swedish Sandomierz Confederation in Poland. Between the Russian and Swedish forces was a corridor formed by the Yakovetsky and Budynsky woods, which the Russians defended by building 6 forts across the gap. Peter, in addition, ordered 4 more redoubts built so the entire system of 10 forts would have a T-shape, providing flanking fire to a Swedish advance. 2 of the redoubts were still being constructed by the morning of the battle, but the remaining 8 were manned by 4,000 Russians with 10,000 cavalry under General Alexander Danilovich Menshikov stationed behind them. Battle. Because of his wound, Charles turned over operational command to Field Marshal Carl Gustav Rehnskiöld paragraph LD. 4 columns of infantry and 6 columns of cavalry were to form during the night, 600 meters south of the redoubts, intending to attack before dawn in order to swiftly bypass the redoubt system and attack the Russian fort. The infantry was in place by 2:30 a.m. but the cavalry arrived late, having lost their way. Riding forward, Axel Gillenkrok observed the Russians at work on the two nearest redoubts, and rode back to inform Rehnskiöld paragraph LD. A reconnoiter by Major General Womer Anton von Schlippenbach was discovered by the Russians and the alarm was sounded by the firing of a pistol. Having lost the element of surprise, and without sufficient cannon to breach the fortifications, Rehnskiöld paragraph LD consulted with Charles, Karl Piper, and Leeuwenhoop on whether or not to proceed with the assault. By the time Rehnskiöld paragraph LD decided to proceed with the attack by quoting, "In the name of God then, let us go forward," it was nearly 4 a.m. on June 28, and dawn was already approaching. The Swedes in Carl Gustav Roh's column quickly overran the first two redoubts, killing every Russian soldier inside them, but by 4:30 a.m., he had stalled attempting to take the third. Leeuwenhoop's 10 battalions on the right bypassed the first four redoubts entirely, advancing to the back line, and with the aid of cavalry, took some redoubts while bypassing others. Two of Roh's rear battalions joined them, indicating orders were lacking clarity as to whether to avoid the redoubts or attack them in series. The cavalry on the left wing, commanded by Major General Hamilton, and an infantry regiment, advanced by passing the redoubts on the left and charged the Russian cavalry, forcing them to retreat. It was 5 a.m. when the left and right wings of the Swedish army had made it past the back line of redoubts, sending the Russian cavalry in retreat. However, Rehnskiöld paragraph LD ordered his cavalry to stop their pursuit, and ordered Leeuwenhoop, already advancing towards the fort, to withdraw to the west. There they awaited Roh's battalions for 2 hours, while the Russian cavalry and Ivan Skoropadskaya's Kosks waited to the north, and 13 Russian battalions deployed north of their camp and 10 to the south, anticipating a Swedish advance. General Roos and 6 battalions became isolated attempting to take the third Russian redoubts. After suffering severe casualties from several assault attempts, Roos led the remaining 1,500 of his original 2,600 men into the Yakovetsky woods to the east at 6 a.m. The Russians reoccupied the first two redoubts and launched a two-pronged attack by 10 regiments around 7 a.m., forcing Roos to retreat towards Poltava and refuge in an abandoned fort by 9 a.m. when he couldn't make it to the Swedish siege works. Roos was forced to surrender his command at 9:30 a.m. The Swedes continued to wait for Roos' troops to return, unaware of their surrender. As time went by, Peter led the 42 battalions of Russian infantry, 22,000 soldiers, into an advance out of the fortified camp, supported by 55 3-pounders plus 32 guns on the ramparts of the fort. 10 regiments of dragoons formed under Lieutenant General Adolf Friedrich Bauer on the Russian right and 6 regiments under Menshikov on the left. Just west of the camp, the Russians were faced by 4,000 Swedish infantry, formed into 10 battalions with 4 3-pounders, and Kreutz's cavalry in the rear. The Russians slowly moved forward to engage. According to Charles and other reports from other Swede officers, the weather at the time was already very hot and humid with the sun obscured by smoke from the Russian cannons of the fort. At 9:45 a.m., Rehnskiöld paragraph LD ordered Leeuwenhoop and the Swedish line to move forward, advancing towards the Russian line, which started firing their cannon at 500 meters. When the Swedes were 50 meters from the Russian line, the Russians opened fire with their muskets from all 4 ranks. Advancing to within 30 meters of the Russian line, the Swedes fired a volley of their own and charged with their muskets and pikedsmen, and the Russian first line retreated towards their second line. The Swedes seemed to be on the verge of a breakthrough, and needed the cavalry under General Kreutz to break the Russian lines. Unfortunately for the Swedes, Kreutz's and the other cavalry units were unable to reform completely and in time. With the Russian line longer than the Swedish line, the Swedish infantry on the left flank lagged behind the right and finally threw down their weapons and fled. As the Swedish right flank was still advancing, a gap began to open in the Swedish line which the Russians filled and the battle turned into a cannon variation. Barely able to gather his cavalry squadrons, Kreutz tried to advance on the right flank, but the Russian battalions were able to form into hollow squares while Menshikov's cavalry outflanked the Swedes and attacked them from the rear. At this point, the Swedish assault had disintegrated, and no longer had organized bodies of troops to oppose the Russian infantry or cavalry. Small groups of soldiers managed to break through and escape to the south through the Budiansky Wood, while many of the rest were overwhelmed, ridden down, or captured. Realizing they were the last Swedes on the battlefield, Charles ordered a retreat to the woods, gathering what remaining forces he could for protection, including the remnants of Kreutz's detachment. The Russians halted at the edge of the woods and their artillery fire stopped. Only the Cossacks and Kalmucks roamed the plains south of the woods. Emerging from the woods around 12 noon, Charles on horseback after his litter was destroyed, and protected by a square of a couple of thousand men, headed to Pushkaryova and his baggage train 5 kilometers to the south, reaching it after 1 p.m. which by the time the battle was over. Charles gathered the remainder of his troops and baggage train, and retreated to the south later that same day at about 7 p.m., abandoning the siege of Poltava. Lewenhaupt led the surviving Swedes and some of the Cossack forces to the Dnieper River, but was doggedly pursued by the Russian regular cavalry and 3,000 Kalmyk auxiliaries and forced to surrender 3 days later at Perevalokna, on July 1. Aftermath. High-ranking Swedes captured during the battle included Field Marshal Rehnskiöld, LD, Major Generals Schlippenbach, Stackelberg, Hamilton and Prince Maximilian Emanuel, as was Piper. Peter held a celebratory banquet in 2 large tents erected on the battlefield. 2 mass graves contained the Russian dead, 500 meters southwest of their camp. Charles and Mazepa escaped with about 1,500 men to Bendary, Moldavia, then controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Charles spent 5 years in exile there before he was able to return to Sweden in December 1715. Popular culture. The battle was portrayed in Poltava, a poem by Alexander Pushkin written in 1828 September, and the monumental 1925 Swedish film Karl XII with paragraph star Ekman as King Charles XII and the Russian emigrant actor Nikolai Dostoevsky as Peter I. Recently the battle was also portrayed in the 2007 Russian film The Sovereign Servant. The story of the battle, told from the point of view of a dying soldier, is related in the Al Stewart song The Coldest Winter in Memory. On their 2012 album Carolus Rex, Swedish power metal band Sabaton has a song named Poltava, detailing the battle. Notes. References. Sources. See also, Surrender at Perevalokna, Battle of Lesnaya, external links, media related to Battle of Poltava at Wikimedia Commons, sequel to Poltava, Diplomacy to Contain Russia 1709-1714 by Bertil Hagman, Battle of Poltava on the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, Russian Order at Battle, Swedish Order at Battle, Battle of Poltava animated battle map by Jonathan Webb.